Okay, now we're gonna play a video. Um, it's just really the audio of Terence McKenna describing self-transforming elf machines. I think that this video is very important in describing, from a very objective perspective, what what these things look like, or what this experience feels like in terms of language, and it should become more clear as you start to see that from the perspective of the simulation. Like I titled the last video, DMT as a program within, as a computer program within the Idealist simulation, this simulated reality, that it's the DMT seems to be acting as a controlled substance to this other like a passport, and so like there's certain restrictions on your passport to this digital other world in the simulation. But I think it's just helpful to like listen to Terence McKenna describe what these things are and what this experience is like, because he is like one of the first people to do this, and one of the most influential voices in this. So,
well, I don't know. Is a self-transforming elf machine a deva? This is a phrase that has been associated with me for many, many years. I encounter self-transforming elf machines, which are creatures, entities, perhaps, although they're not made out of matter. They're made out of, as nearly as I can figure it out, they're made out of syntax driving light. But if what your question addresses is the issue of entities on the other side, there are definitely entities on the other side for me, and there seem to be such for many, many other people. I'm not by any standard sensitive, so if I get entities, then they are substantial and capable of defending themselves.
I mean, I think it's silly to think that like from the perspective of like Star Trek or Star Wars, that life in the universe, which is incredibly hostile to biological life forms, that life would be like ourselves, that it should be like we are a reflection of our environment, which is like the earth, and we are made up mostly of water and things of the earth, and we reflect this construct. But I mean, you would think that if there were life in the universe, the vast majority of the universe is empty space, or whatever you want to call it, that you would think that life would look more like that. That they presume that the space is empty, that there's nothing in it. But there's the possibility that life doesn't take on the kinds of physical forms that we're accustomed to, and that I think the people are becoming, now that we haven't really come in contact with say gray aliens or something like that, that they're becoming more open-minded to life looking more like self-transforming machine elves or something like that, and being of the opinion that maybe that this is what extraterrestrial life really looks like, that it might be difficult to determine if it's in your head or external to you to begin with. And these might be things that people have been describing for 20,000 years or something like that, which would be logical and rational in a sense. I mean, the people of the past weren't, they weren't any less informed than we are. I suspect they had a lot of time on their hands to, they didn't have a lot of extracurricular activities like golfing or something. They spent most of their time either working or just thinking about their own reality, which, and their history wasn't as retrospective as ours is, so they didn't have a lot of that to sort of dwell into, and they didn't have a lot of time watching Netflix either. So I mean, their minds may have been formed a little bit differently on things like this.
It's one of the most challenging parts of the whole psychedelic landscape, because most people can accept the idea of disordered sensory input, recovery of traumatic memory material, so forth and so on. But what are we to do with an elf? That becomes a little harder to contextualize in psychoanalytic theory, although Jung did a good job when he said autonomous elements can escape from the psyche's control and present themselves as independent entities. I'm not sure he's ever seen a self-transforming elf machine. Oh, it's the defining characteristic of the true DMT flash. I mean, it is not subtle. These things mob you like badly trained Rottweilers. They come back.
But Jung also described the collective unconsciousness, and that this realm, I mean, from a materialist or physicalist perspective of sorts, but that Jung was very receptive to these ideas being more spiritual, but those those sort of ideas that fell out of materialist perspectives or frameworks were not received as well at that time, which was a much more materialist and physicalist time. But today we would look at the collective unconsciousness as, say, a cloud computing structure of this sort of computer game. It's like that Mario has his world, and there's a cloud outside of his world where there's data. Say, like, former games are stored there. His particular game is stored in one place, but there's 500 games that have already been played, and those are stored outside of the actual game itself. They're stored either on a drive somewhere, or an external drive, or maybe in the cloud itself, which is sort of a materialist parallel to like a sort of cosmic cloud, which you could describe as a collective unconsciousness.
Bounding forward by the
which
dozens,
could be inhabited by self-transforming
they
machine
jump into your body. They jump out of your body. And I thought, it maps to some degree over the archetype of the little people, the leprechaun, the fae, and being Irish and being Jungian. I'm willing to entertain, maybe I have a special relationship to this stuff. But then in the Amazon, the people using DMT that I studied in the early 70s, the reason they did it, they said, was to speak with the little people. What puzzles me about my contacts with these beings is it conforms to, let's say, the Irish model. They are small. They live under hills, or when you're with them, you have a sense that you are somehow underground. They are full of merriment, almost to a manic and frightening level. It's sort of like a Bugs Bunny cartoon gone berserk. They are friendly, but play rough. In other words, it's a land of explosions and falling anvils. It's like a Roadrunner cartoon or something. But the overwhelming feeling is love, but I spell it L-U-V to distinguish it from the ordinary kind, because it's just this kind of crazy, childish affection. And they're delighted to have me in their presence. Well, now that also corresponds with the Irish model, or with worldwide folklore of little creatures, little people in the woods. what's happening that is not mappable onto fairyland or leprechauns or Fintornian beings or anything like that, or anything else I've ever heard of, is that these entities have an agenda. And it's a very curious agenda. They use a language which you see. It is made out of sound. In other words, it is sound, but you see it in that state. And the entire...
And this could be something that is a way of also describing the Tower of Babel, that it's a tower, but it's a tower sculpted by language and communication, that it's some sort of an interface to this world. It's like the Tower of Babel in Mario's world. What purpose would that serve? What would Mario be building a tower to escape from his game from? And what would that tower look like? It wouldn't necessarily be going up, because there's no up in his world. It would be going out or somewhere to escape. And in that world, I guess you would be a machine elf or something like that. But it seems like the machine elves are some sort of component that exists in a world. I think who was it? I think it was John Dee that was talking about these elementals as well, that they live between the material world and the celestial world, and they're sort of a product of that world. And that this also sort of describes these kinds of elemental creatures, which again, elementals in a computer simulation would simply, again, be some sort of functional program that controls the weather or gravity or something like that. Those would be elemental forces. They're described as like earth, wind, and fire, and water, and things like that. But in the terms of Mario's world, water isn't like a substance you drink. It's another kind of program within the system.
Point of the encounter from their perspective seems to be to teach you to do this. They want you to transform your language. They want you to speak Elfish. And, what? If you've never done DMT and you just smoked it and you're 30 seconds into this experience and this is what it's come down to, you wonder what to make of it. I've thought about this for years and years and years, and I don't know why there should be
And is this their attempt to say, and again, these are hypotheticals on top of hypothetical, is this an attempt to reconstruct the language of the Tower of Babel, like the language that is a more sophisticated language, and where he goes into this, that our language today is, it isn't just that it's from the Tower of Babel story, that languages were broken into like Chinese or English or something, or back in those days maybe Akkadian or something, or Sanskrit. It's that the language was sort of degenerated from some higher language like this down to something that was less formidable and less functional, and that this is a more functional, like visual language that may have unified a people at that time and could reunify people in the future, which is, the Tower of Babel is kind of timeless, especially, again, from the sense of the simulation, which, time doesn't really exist in the simulation. It's digitized with space-time, and so if it's in a computer game, it's just relative to the computer game. That there's time maybe outside of the computer game where Mario is, but within Mario's world, there's time and there's space, but it's not real.
Visible syntactical intelligence giving language lessons in hyperspace, but that
Через війни та конфлікти ми мусимо залишати наші домівки і всі наші речі. Ми навіть не маємо їжі. Діти в усьому світі дуже потребують вашої...
That certainly consistently seems to be what is happening. And it seems to me that language is some kind of enterprise of human beings that is not finished. That we have now left the grunts and the digs of the elbow somewhat in the dust, but the most articulate, brilliantly pronounced and projected English or French or German or Chinese is still a poor carrier of our intent, a very limited bandwidth for the intense compression of data that we are trying to put across to each other. A language that you can see is far less ambiguous than a language that you hear. If I read a paragraph of Proust, then we could spend the rest of the afternoon discussing what did he mean. But if we look at a piece of sculpture by Henry Moore, we can discuss what did he mean, but at a certain level there is a kind of shared bedrock that isn't in the Proust passage. We each stop at a different level with the textual passage. With the three-dimensional object, we all sort of start from the same place and then work out our interpretations. You know, is it a nude? Is it an animal? Is it bronze? Is it wood? Is it poignant? Is it comical? So forth and so on. So this is not a very scientific part of the rap, because it's very hard to convince people that there are non-human intelligences this side of Genebel Ganubi, and when you tell them that these non-human intelligences are accessed through the diminutive mushrooms growing on their front lawn, they just write you off as a squirrel. But this question of the non-human intelligences is very, very much on the agenda. All shamans in all times and places have claimed this. Once you've encountered these things, you have to take them seriously, to the point of you have to understand, where do they fit into the great order of being? What are these things? How can there be a life form not made of matter? In other words, how can they be intelligent and coherent but have no fixed body outline? Where are they when you're not there? Is it an ongoing thing? Is something going on this planet? Are these the controllers? Are you getting into a back channel that weren't cleared for? And this is to my mind the most chilling and appalling and exhilarating possibility of all, when you go back over the shamanism thing, you say, you shamans, now where is this all coming from? They will tell you it comes from ancestors. Well, that's a cheerful and fairly sanitized concept, but when you deconstruct it, ancestors are dead people. What is actually being suggested there is that there is a kind of ecology of souls, one energy threshold over, that is co-present.
The question is, why would the DMT machine elves want to teach people this language? What purpose would this serve? And this is sort of an open-ended question, but it could be, he's saying that the language is unevolved, or that it has a long ways to go, but it's possible from looking at the other legends of the fall, that you look at the other religions that we talked about yesterday, where they discuss the different views of the Tower of Babel moment, from the book transhumanism, that there is, there's the version in the Genesis that we know of. There's the one in there's the Platonic version. There's the one from the Popol Vuh. There's the Vedic version of this story. There's one from Mesopotamia. I think there's probably a number more than 5 or 6. There's probably hundreds, but they represent not this idea, a materialist view that the language is old, but that our language hasn't evolved to this point yet. This other view represents the idea that man came from a much higher civilization that fell into the simulation, and that this language of the machine elves is an attempt to reintegrate us back to that language. That's also a possibility.
Well, strangely enough, that's what the Irish myth of the Fae says. It says these are dead people. These are souls that linger in our environment, and this is what souls look like. Again, folklore is only a guide, but if what we are dabbling with, if what lies at the end of the road of shamanism is the dissolution of the boundary between life and death itself,
and that's what this represents. This is the tree of life and the tree of death, and we are in this boundary, this simulation, and this idea that that the elves are describing the dead. Again, it describes a non-materialist worldview of, say, the simulation, where when your physical body is gone, there's still a part of your program that exists that is conscious, or something other than that. That the physical body is simply, from the perspective of Kabbalah, that it's part of the Asaya, that it's this material body, but that you go to the next level. I think it's called something with a Y or whatever. But that you move up into these higher levels.
Then the million-year intuition that this was a path worth following will be dramatically vindicated. And one of the reasons I've preached DMT so furiously is I just want a larger body of people to take it so that we can compare data. We need to understand, how is this possible? It raises a whole host of questions. One is, not only how is this possible, but then given that it is possible, how has it been kept secret? How can millions of people go to the grave, raise children, hold jobs, so forth and so on, go to the grave, and the news of a doorway standing that agape hasn't penetrated? I mean, most people believe they're imprisoned in this world, and that the only hope is maybe 15.
This is also a very Gnostic view, that you're imprisoned in this world, like the Matrix, like a simulation. And how do you escape from this world?
Years at the ashram and hideous acts of self-abnegation and control and so forth and so on. And actually, the boundary between us and an unspeakably bizarre world, it's 30 seconds away at any time, as long as you have DMT available to smoke. That's appalling to me. I mean, it means we don't know nothing.
I've been looking for a product like this my whole life. We're all putting it on, looking in the mirror, and we're like, oh my God, this is a...
Yeah, well, the classical myth about leprechauns is that they want to keep you. If they catch you, or if you mess with them, they'll hold you. And then you have to bargain your way out. And the bargain is always the solution of a riddle. Notice that what's happening here is it's all about linguistic prowess. It's all about poetic skill. It's all about language ability. Only the eloquent, only the clever Only those who are masters.
And this in itself is sort of parallel to a computer game in that the challenge is not physical. It's a mental ability to solve the puzzle and to go to the next level or escape or move around in this system. It's very similar to that paradigm.
Of riddlery and pun are acceptable to these entities. Apparently that's what they value. Why? I guess because they're made of language. So, and they themselves have, when I try to describe to people what they are or what they look like, various things can be said. They're like self-dribbling jeweled basketballs. In other words, they don't have faces or anything, not the little yellow leather jerkins and the curve-pointed shoes, not that. Self-dribbling jeweled basketballs, and they use the language to make objects. That's what this language, how this language is different from ordinary English. English, we can make meaning. The DMT language makes objects. It's like a higher dimensional language. And so these things bound forward with the complete purpose of delighting you. And they reach into the air, into their bodies, into some nearby invisible dimension, and they pull out what I would call words, puns, objects, hallucinations, things which manage to be all those things simultaneously. And they say, look at this. And it's purely designed to dazzle and astound. And then a colleague will elbow the little guy aside and say, no, look at this.
You know, and the thing is, too, is if these are a part of our consciousness or subconsciousness, is there some way that something like this could be synthesized into our computer system through something like Chat GPT, like this idea that we're creating AI, and if AI is simply a product of our own consciousness and our own creation, would be potentially be creating something like this in a parallel type of creature in our own creation of AI.
And they're all in front of you, chirping, clamoring,
creations.
And these objects that they make begin themselves to speak and float away and reproduce. And you've arrived. 30 seconds ago you were sitting in a room with your grubby friend somewhere pursuing spiritual understanding. Now this is going on, and it's very hard to not be horrified. I mean, the cognitive dissonance, the neck-snapping switch of dimensions, and then after about 3, 4, 5 minutes, it retracts. It loses its vitality, and it begins to pull away from you, almost like a boat pulling away from a dock. And in fact, I had one trip where, metaphorically, not having hands, they all turned and waved and said, "Deja vu, deja vu," which is, of course.
And so now we are going to go into Dr. Strassman's book. It's his other book, After the Spirit Molecule. It's a book that interprets DMT in terms of the Old Testament. Okay, this is a podcast with Dr. Rick Strassman discussing his book DMT and the Soul of Prophecy, a new science of spiritual revelation in the Hebrew Bible. With it's with Rabbi Adam Jacobs, and they're discussing the relationship between the DMT experience as as to whether it's something within your head or in your mind, or as to whether it's something external from an idealist perspective. And I think that these are very good questions.
Or is there something deeper to it and people are actually managing to tap into a higher reality? Well, my next guest researched that and has a lot to say about it. Join us right now for that topic and more at Beyond Belief. We're in the midst of a renaissance of the use of psychedelic drugs. Are these drugs just tricks, just manifestations of a stimulated brain? Or is there something deeper to it and people are actually managing to tap into a higher reality? Well, my next guest researched that and has a lot to say about it. Join us right now for that topic and more at Beyond Belief. Hi, Dr. Strassman. It's great to have you here, and I find this topic to be enormously interesting and something that really seems to be on people's minds these days, and I'm really excited to be able to discuss them with you. You are a researcher who has picked up, it seems to me, like on the mantle of what was sort of dropped in the 60s and early 70s, and there was, of course, at one time a big interest in psychedelics. I think that became unpopular for a variety of reasons, and it seems to me, based on the popular literature that I'm seeing, is that we're sort of having a bit of a renaissance of openness to these kinds of experiences and things that they can teach us and ways that they can help us, so on and so forth. My first question for you is about the word psychedelic itself. You point out in your book that it means mind disclosing, which I thought was a very interesting term and a great term. So apparently it's some kind of key to unlock hidden resources, subconscious contents of the mind. What I guess that everyone wants to know, including myself, is what is being unlocked real or illusory in some fashion?
Exactly.
So the term psychedelic, it can mean either mind manifesting or mind disclosing. And I prefer that term over more constrained definitions or terms like psychotomimetic was a popular term back in the day because of the belief that psychedelics mimicked naturally occurring psychosis. Hallucinogenic was the popular medical legal term for many years. It's a bit constrained as well, though, because people don't necessarily uniformly experience visions or voices. And also, it makes you kind of have to consider, what is a hallucination after all? Is it real or is it illusory, as you're alluding to? And also, hallucinogen kind of disparages the effects and makes them kind of pathological. There's another term which has become increasingly popular, which is entheogen, which kind of ties into mystico-mimetic. It conflates the spiritual properties or spiritual characteristics of the state with naturally occurring spiritual experiences. The location of the visions and the voices, if those occur, or just the feeling of being immersed in an alternate reality, is that being generated by the drug? Is it your brain on drugs, or are you actually perceiving another level of reality which you weren't able to before because of the receiving ability of the brain being altered? I don't think you can really tell. I think
it's hard to tell, but from an idealist perspective, it's from a materialist perspective, that these things would be coming from your mind. Unless there's some other part of the material world, like dark matter, which again could be a possibility, or like say like neutrinos, a world of neutrinos. These could be generated simply by neutrinos, or something that we can't detect at this point, and then we don't have a real connection to with our physical bodies. They seem to just pass right through us. It could be something like that, or some undiscovered part of the physical world, or it could be that we need a different framework, an idealist framework, to look at these entities in terms of like being in a video game simulation, and to look at them from that frame. Then they suddenly make a little more sense that they're a different part, like a different level of the video game or something like that.
A more generic explanation or understanding is that psychedelics reveal things which were previously invisible. And are those in your own mind, or are they in the outside levels of reality, or some combination thereof?
It's interesting, and I guess we'll get more into this as we go, but the reason that people use it often is because they want to have some kind of what we call a spiritual experience. And when they do have those, there do seem to be certain commonalities to them. You do point out a lot of these in your book. The feeling of oneness, of connectedness to the universe, or whatever you might describe it as, connection to spiritual beings, a feeling of love. There do seem to be commonalities, but would you say that, why should it be that you take this mind-altering substance and it produces those effects as opposed to any others? I do know there's also something called a bad trip. Are those just as likely to occur, or when people alter their minds, their brains with these substances, are they more likely to have those earlier kind of experiences that I mentioned?
Well, the ultimate outcome of any experience on psychedelic drugs is the drug itself, and the dose, obviously. But just as important is what is called the set and the setting. The set is, who you are at the time you experience the drug. Your mental state, your physical state, your previous experiences with psychedelics or none, your intention, your hopes and your fears about what you're going to undergo, your spiritual practice. Are you meditating regularly? Do you study scripture? The other important element is what is called the setting, which is the environment in which you trip. So that could be indoors or outdoors. It is also the social and the cultural context, and the people that you're tripping around. Are they friends? Are they foes? Are they strangers? Are they loved ones? What do they expect? What do they hope for and fear? Just like you do. So depending. I mean, you could be borderline schizophrenic and taking amphetamines and being homeless and being totally stressed out, and you take some LSD, for example, and it's a very bad experience. Or you could be somebody that's been living at a monastery for 15 years, completely steeped in the tradition. The experiences are placed in the context of the larger tradition. They confirm the tradition's teachings rather than being the goal of any particular practice. So and there's other disciples on your teachers is there. So that's quite conducive to a more positive outcome.
You mentioned this term, which I've never heard before, which is theoneurology. And my understanding is that is an idea that the brain is the agent through which God communicates with humans, which is fascinating, and I do think, at least from my vantage point...
This is really interesting, too, in the sense of the simulation, that the idea that the brain is really some kind of program or something, and its qualities are transcendent from the matter that we think of it as.
At which point there are certain Kabbalistic teachings, mystical teachings that certainly seem to indicate that that's the case, but I'd like to ask you as...
And then you would think that like all the other parts of our body would sort of fall into this sort of programs too, like within like Hinduism, you have the different parts of the body that are connected to the earth in different ways. You have the chakras and everything that the chakras would be part of a system of a computer network, that they're really an input and output system into your character, like Mario, that this is where the programs go into and out of the character, the living character.
As a scientist,
as opposed to a non-living character.
How do we know?
Or an NPC,
why would we
I think
that that's the case?
Well, my proposing that isn't quite as a scientist. It's more as a theologian, or somebody that's got a foot in both worlds.
Mm-hmm.
The reigning paradigm of the biology of spiritual experience is what's called neurotheology. And so that proposes that the brain is the center of it all. There's certain things like drugs, meditation, prayer, fasting, sleep deprivation, those kinds of things are stimuli that trigger a brain reflex, which produces certain changes in consciousness, which are described after the fact as spiritual. Some of the qualities you described, the feeling of oneness, ecstasy, out-of-body travel, those kinds of things. And the reason the brain is configured that way is for evolutionary purposes. You might be, if you have those experiences, you might be more empathic, more creative, more compassionate, perceive things more accurately in the outside world. So that is kind of the model of your brain on drugs. If you trip, it gives you the impression of communicating with God. In my study of Hebrew biblical prophecy, and especially of Maimonides, I ended up turning that model on its head and developed an alternative one, which is called theoneurology, which is a top-down approach rather than a bottom-up approach. Yeah, and it proposes that the brain is configured in such a manner as to be able to provide a channel of communication between humans and God. So it isn't because of an evolutionary advantageous reasoning which proposes this. It's more of God teaching us certain things, some of which may have no evolutionary advantage whatsoever. For example, mixing of wool and of linen is prohibited. What's the evolutionary advantage of that? The red heifer, kashrut, all those things. So it expands the the notion of what is spiritual. It isn't only spiritual from the perspective of a human-centered point of view, but more of a God-centered one.
Have you seen this TED Talk called My Stroke of Insights with Dr. Jill Bolte Taylor?
Yeah, right.
Okay, so if anyone out there has not seen it, it's one of the most popular TED Talks that they have on their website. You can go and see it, and it's 18 minutes of what I think is a enormously engaging experience that this woman had, where she basically lost the function of her left brain and and she's a brain researcher, got to experience the world through the right brain only, and to see what that was actually like. And her description of it is what I would describe as extremely spiritual. In other words, without the filter of the left brain, which is the more analytical, the more mathematical, like controlling the thought patterns, it seemed like that she was free to expand, so to speak, and encompass much more of the universe. And my question for you is, could it be from your scientific or your theological background that the brain is actually the blockage itself? In other words, yes, it allows us to function and exist in this plane of reality, let's call it, but really what it's doing is blocking out most of ultimate reality, allowing us to only navigate within a very narrow band of it.
Yeah.
Is that
simulation?
possible that if Dr. Taylor lost half of her brain and had this totally expansive vision, that, so to speak, if we had no brain, we would be fully immersed in it, not because we'd be dead, which would be true, but because we would be able to see much more clearly. Anything resonate with you in that?
Well, yeah, I mean, without a brain, we'd be, who knows what that would be like. Well, if you listen, carefully, to her presentation, especially in the beginning stages of her stroke, it really sounds a lot like a DMT experience. Things become pixelated. That was the most striking first hint that I got that perhaps naturally occurring DMT is involved. One of the most interesting things about DMT, which is the compound that I used to study, dimethyltryptamine, is it's produced in quite high concentrations in the mammalian brain. And concentrations increase in the visual cortex at the time of death in rodents. So the DMT experience is extremely visual. It's out of body. It's quite emotional. It's quite profound. And the fact that concentrations of DMT are comparable to those of serotonin and of dopamine indicates that perhaps there's a DMT neurotransmitter system in the mammalian brain, which you would have to wonder, what is it doing there? Why is the brain making high levels of naturally occurring psychedelic substance? So I think that gets to your question about, the filtering mechanism of the brain, or the filtering function of the brain. It could be, that our everyday consensus reality is the result of a narrow, band of ongoing DMT secretion, which keeps things within the normal channel, so to speak. And when concentrations increase, for any number of reasons, things then become psychedelic, for the lack of a better word. And in conditions where there's low levels of DMT, perhaps, this is all speculative at this point. We don't know anything other than the dying brain increasing levels of DMT. But it could be with low levels of DMT, things are flat, depressed, kind of one-dimensional. So I think the whole question of the normal function of brain DMT is just beginning to be studied. There's a group in Ann Arbor that's looking at levels of DMT in dream sleep in rodents. So our concentrations increase when you're dreaming.
Right. And it strikes me that these are all moments, experiences that people have in which spiritually minded people would say, like, the veil is thinner. Sleep, altered states of consciousness, meditation,
Thinning of
prayer,
the veil.
things that you mentioned, sort of thin out that barrier. And I'm just wondering aloud if that's not what's going on. I guess I'm interested in distinguishing between whether it's a chemical illusion, in which case I would be largely disappointed, even though I know it might have some clinical benefits, versus whether it actually is affording us a window into something much grander. But that, I guess, remains to be seen.
Right. Well, the analogy of thinning of the veil is appropriate. But what is it a veil between? Is it between?
So, and the thinning of this veil is what we talked about, and the veil that is being referenced, from my perspective, is the veil of the temple, which is a symbol of the simulation. So the Temple of Solomon, which has a veil between the Holy of Holies and another veil, which is referred to, I think, as a curtain, at the next level in the courtyard, and then a final veil, or curtain. So there's 3 levels of this occlusion between us and seeing the whole world. It's a metaphor and a sense for the ability to communicate or connect with this higher world. And so, like in the apocalypse, the word the apocalypse means the unveiling. So, and that unveiling is due to the prophecy, and so the veil is being lifted. But the veil also has a feminine connotation, in that the bride wears the veil, and that the bride is the Shekinah behind the veil in the holiest of holies. And so this metaphor is symbolic of the simulation that we live in, and the kind of quarantine or prison that we live in. And so we'll just finish with Chapter 2 of Transhumanism, the topological metaphor of the medium and its revolutionary inversion. The first event, the 4-stage descent of man, and the 3 Yahwisms. It starts with, within most ancient mythologies and traditions, the Tower of Babel moment was cast in a wider context, in which the creation of man himself was metaphorically described as a descent, a fall from a higher position to a lower one. This higher position, in turn, is a symbol of the primordial nothingness or unity itself, or himself, as we shall see momentarily, from which all creation merges in an endless process of differentiation. And so the fall is a symbol of man losing connection to this other world and being constrained from it, and that DMT is sort of a mediator of this, or DMT, as we view it in this from a simulation, as a kind of program within the computer game that is used to control, like Super Mario or something like that, that it's a kind of mediating program to mediate his consciousness and his inability to see beyond the game that he's in. One may dismiss, as the contemporary academy or organized monotheistic religions often do, the multiform mythologies and allegories in which this metaphor has been presented as a relic of a bygone, less sophisticated, obsolete worldview. Or, as we do here, we may assume, for the sake of argument and high speculation, that it was the legacy of an advanced culture from high antiquity, whose scientific sophistication was equal to or exceeded our own. Viewed in this way, the interpretation of the ancient myth and texts which contain or reject that metaphor changes profoundly. And from this channel, we believe that this is from the original one religion from like 75,000 years ago, like around the Toba supervolcano explosion. It was like after that you had the Ice Age, and this great civilization seemed to have formed around the equator. Now, we don't know. It may have been earlier than that, and it may have been like transdimensional or something, in the sense that if it was a culture that understood the nature of reality itself, then a lot of these myths could simply be just remnants of our memories of something that was much higher than what we have today. We just are incapable of seeing it at this point. And we will finish the rest of this later.
Us in a spiritual world, or is it between our normal everyday consciousness and our unconscious or our subconscious? So that is where the issue of peer review becomes important. Are you just talking to yourself, or are you talking to somebody else? And that ultimately leads to the notion of prophecy and of false prophecy. How do you distinguish between the two?
Yes, and it seems to me that the answer to that question is pretty important. However you slice it, they both have their implications. But let me ask you: you were a student of Zen Buddhism, as I understand it, for about 20 years, but later you concluded that you thought that the DMT research that you were doing more closely aligned with the prophecies listed in the Hebrew Bible than they do in Buddhist scripture. How did you come to that realization? Tell me if I'm saying it wrong, but is that correct? And how did you come to that conclusion?
Yeah, it's pretty complicated, but I'll do my best. I started off studying Zen Buddhism. So I was an undergraduate at Stanford in the early 70s, and psychedelics were everywhere. And Buddhism was just beginning to be studied academically as a result of the monks immolating themselves in Vietnam in protest. So the Defense Department started to fund departments of Buddhist studies all around the country. Kind of an ironic twist.
Yeah.
And one of the freshly minted PhDs ended up at Stanford, and I took her class on Indian Buddhism, and I was enthralled. It was the closest thing I'd ever come across that captured the essence of the psychedelic experience. So it strengthened my belief that there was some intimate relationship between psychedelic states and Buddhist practice. So I spent a couple of years wandering through the wastelands of American Buddhism, and finally ended up at a Zen temple up in Mount Shasta, California. And I was depressed. I dropped out of medical school. It was kind of a mess. And they saved my life, basically, and I was extremely indebted. And I became a serious student and a practitioner over the next 20 years or so. So the ultimate goal of Zen Buddhism, not Tibetan Buddhism or Theravada Buddhism, is what's called Kensho, the Satori enlightenment experience. And if you read the Heart Sutra, that experience or that state is without form, feeling, consciousness, perception, or volition. It's empty. It's the manifestation of what's called emptiness in Buddhism, shunyata. So that was my spiritual scaffolding, the platform that I entered my DMT studies with. And most of my volunteers also shared that point of view, because most of them were interested in Eastern religions and were meditating. So I expected the pharmacology of DMT, if it was inherently spiritual or was capable of producing spiritual states, would be a Zen Buddhist Kensho enlightenment experience. And it was anything but. It was full of content. There were beings, there were visions, there were voices. There was all kinds of interactions. The personality was maintained, even strengthened. There was the there was space, there was time, distorted, but still, there were space and there were time, and there was time. So it was quite different than the Kensho experience that both I and most of the volunteers expected. So I had to go back to the drawing board for a spiritual model, at least from that perspective, which was consistent with the DMT experience, and the Buddhist model, or at least the Zen Kensho model, was not consistent with my data. At the same time, I was being discouraged from continuing my studies by the Buddhist organization for a number of complicated reasons, most of which were political, as opposed to truth-oriented. And, that gave me the opportunity to return to studying Judaism. And as I was going through Tanakh, I became impressed with what I ended up calling prophetic experience, which isn't prophecy as commonly understood as foretelling or predicting, but it encompasses any spiritual experience undergone by any character in the text. The nameless, soldier that has a veridical dream, predicting the victory of Israel, or Moses on Mount Sinai. It's any spiritual experience, and in the Guide of the Perplexed, Maimonides articulates 10 levels of prophetic experience, some of which are just courage, inspiration, the ability to teach. So with a expanded definition of the prophetic experience, I began to compare the DMT state with the prophetic state, and phenomenologically, descriptively, the visions and the voices, the emotions, the effects on the body,